report. New developments out of the courtroom in Springfield today. An armed robbery suspect, also accused of assaulting multiple police officers, was arraigned earlier today.
Western Mass News reporter Paris Dunford joins us live with the latest details. Paris.
Chris, Mary, that's right. Joseph Gonzalez was arraigned earlier today here in Springfield District Court, pushed back by his long hospital stay last week. However, Gonzalez did not appear in person inside the courtroom today per his defense attorney's request. On Thursday, Western Mass News cameras were rolling, awaiting the arraignment of Joseph Gonzalez. He's accused in the armed robbery at Metro PCS in Springfield last Tuesday and assaulting 3 police officers. One of them involved in a violent struggle when Gonzalez is accused of grabbing the officer's gun and firing it, injuring his own hand. However, his defense attorney requested that he not appear in person in court.
Already been significant media attention to this case due to the kind of dramatic events that unfolded at Mr. Gonzalez's arrest.
One reason for the significant media attention, Springfield Police Department publicly thanking a Good Samaritan, Pedro Perez, for stepping in and helping the initial officer struggling with Gonzalez. The defense attorney also says there are some questions surrounding the identification of Gonzalez as a suspect in the armed robbery.
The initial description of the suspect that the witness described said that he had a gray jacket or sweater on, but then when they looked at the footage, he had a brown sweater or jacket on.
Because of these reasons, the judge granted the defense's attorney's motion to not appear. A not guilty plea was entered, and Gonzalez is being held without the right to bail, pending a dangerousness hearing. Now, Western Mass News is digging a little deeper into the criminal history of Gonzalez. Court paperwork states that in 2006, he was charged with armed robbery after he robbed an Easy Mart on River Street in West Springfield. The documents state Gonzalez pointed a silver handgun at an employee and demanded money. In an interview with police, Gonzalez admitted to the armed robbery and, quote, stated that he was sorry he did the robbery and he would never do it again. Gonzalez was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in prison for that crime. And that dangerousness hearing for Gonzalez is scheduled for this upcoming Wednesday. Until then, he will be held without the right to bail. Reporting live in Springfield, Paris Dunford for Western Mass News.